So recommendation 3. This is another one with extremely strong evidence. This relates getting further into our phonics and word recognition, teaching students to decode words, to analyze word parts as we're getting into more difficult words in the higher grade levels, and to write, spell, and recognize, read words. Here we have 18 studies from the panel, high quality studies that led to this recommendation. So again, across a diverse populations in the different studies, going from kindergarten, first, second, and third grade, so all levels of phonics and word recognition. So again, you see a lot of studies, that's where we're headed towards, and a diverse sample headed towards that strong evidence. The findings in 13 of the 8 studies, there were positive findings for any outcome measure that they were giving. Those tended to be either word reading or spelling types of measures. And there were 4 studies that didn't show any differences. They were only looking at word reading outcomes. And when the panel looked at the intervention of those studies versus the 13 that had positive studies, there just wasn't as much explicit instruction in how to do these aspects. So the delivery that Carol is talking about is as important as the content. So how you teach these and how explicit and systematic this instruction is an important aspect of these action steps. So in order to have strong phonics and word recognition instruction, not surprisingly, we need to teach students to use these letter sounds to then decode the words, to come up with pronounceable words or recognizable words. As students progress, they then move into action 2, common sound spelling patterns. So those would be like any of the letter combinations. SH says sh, TH, even in many programs you get into like ANK says ank, like in sank, right? So looking for those word patterns in words that are larger chunks and not just the individual letter sounds. Action 3, teaching students to recognize common word parts, and that is connected with action 2 because we're also getting into prefixes and suffixes and larger word parts as you get particularly into third grade and even multisyllabic words. Action step 4, having students read decodable words both in isolation so they get practice with how to decode and encode these words with these sounds, and they can get fluent at that without before they're reading the text. And then, of course, as we talked about, and we're going to get even further into in recommendation 4, it's important that they apply that then in text. So we need both of those as part of that action step. Teaching regular and irregular high-frequency words so that students can recognize them. English is not completely regular. Anybody know languages that are pretty high on the regular scale? Spanish is pretty high. Any others? I think I heard of German. German is pretty high. One of the highest is actually Finnish. Almost every letter sound matches perfectly onto that. It would be lovely if English was like that. So if you've got kind of your Spanish and German and Finnish down on this end, English gets a little bit of a bad rap, but it is pretty far down on the continuum. Maybe on your walk or your drive to lunch today, you found it along the way. But it gets a worse rap than it actually has. If students know these common sound spelling patterns and their letter sounds and can recognize word parts, they can read about 70% of the words that we see in text, which is pretty high. But there's still a lot of words that we have to teach as irregular words. And so it's important to have that as part of our instruction as well. And obviously they're essential to the meaning of text very often. So that's part of that action step too. So we have pretty consistent evidence across many, many studies in K3, across all the grade levels, that teaching students how to do this makes the language, first of all, more regular for them. What we find in many of the studies, just as an aside that wasn't part of this panel aspect, is that English language learners often do really well in interventions that have phonics and word recognition, sometimes better than their peers who are having reading difficulties, because they probably aren't actually having a reading difficulty in that intervention. It was probably just that no one explained the language to them, in that sense, the written language part of their second language, or third language, or fourth language for some of them. And so having this really explicit systematic instruction can be very valuable for them as well. So let's talk about implementation.
Okay, this is the one I really geek out about. And it's blending. And so I'm going to start with action 1, which is blending the letter sounds and sound spelling patterns. In all of the work that I've done across the country in schools and working with teachers, it's become really apparent that we don't spend enough time preparing teachers on how to teach blending. Our biggest strategy that we teach students is to say, sound it out. That's our biggest blending strategy that a lot of us as teachers have. So I want to spend some time, went back the other way. There we go. I want to spend a little bit of time sharing a little bit of background information that's been really powerful as we work with teachers on the importance of this action and this recommendation with the blending. So I want to share with you some research that Beth Harn and her group did out of, her group was all out of University of Oregon at the time. This was back in 2008. Beth is still there, but some of the other ones aren't. But anyways, it has the reference that's right there. But what they wanted to look at is what blending strategies were students using at the end of kindergarten, and how did that correlate with where they were at in oral reading fluency at the end of first grade. So what blending strategies they were using at the end of kindergarten, how that correlated with oral reading fluency at the end of first grade. So what they did is they used a nonsense word fluency measure, and it's only for the purposes of assessing what blending strategies students are using. We do not use nonsense word for our instruction. When we blend, we'll talk about different ways to do blending instruction in a minute, but when we're doing blending instruction, we're using regular real words. I want to be really clear with that. So I don't want people to leave from here and going back and teaching kids to blend using nonsense words. We don't need to. But it's a very pure way we can assess it, because they can't memorize, they don't have the words memorized because they're nonsense words, they're irregular. So if we look at this CVC nonsense word, the students can answer one of 4 ways. They could go b, a, k, just say each sound and not do any sort of recoding, or they could do sound by sound and recode. They could say b, a, k, bok, or they could do a partial blend. They could say b-ok, or they could say bok, right, as a partial blend. Or they could read it as a whole unit, bok. What they found when they looked at where kids were at the end of kindergarten, tracked them, waited a year, then collected data from those same students at the end of first grade, what they found is, and this is the key word right here, unitization. Students that were doing some form of initial unitization, chunking of the word at the end of kindergarten, were highly likely to reach the benchmark goal at the end of first grade. Students that were not doing initial recoding or unitization on their first initial read of it were highly unlikely to have reached that end of first grade oral reading fluency benchmark goal. Now, when this was, and again, this came out in 2008, and it's been replicated in a couple of other studies. And when it first came out, I, as a literacy coach, was like, no, yeah, I was skeptical, because I thought when we got kids here at the end of kindergarten that we'd been doing pretty good with it. So amazingly enough, this was shared with me, and right after that, I went out into a school district in June, so it was the end of the school year. And one of the very first things they said to me when I walked in the door is they said, you know, Carol, we're doing a great job at kindergarten, but something's happening in first grade. And our kids get to the end of first grade and we've lost them. So we really want to spend the time talking about what we can do and what we can change in first grade. Well, I had just been shown this research before I went in, and I said, you know what? I wonder if something's happening in kindergarten that we couldn't improve, or that we couldn't go back and look at. Let's look at this unitization research and let's go back. They happened to use Dibbles, and so they had the nonsense word and they did the paper pencil. So they had that year's first grade students' booklets down in their basement from last year when they were kindergarten students. So they only had 26% of their first grade students that had reached the oral reading fluency goal that year. And I said, let's pull up those booklets and let's see where they were at. Guess what we found? We took those 26% that had passed the oral reading fluency goal. Guess where they were responding at the end of kindergarten? Most of them were here. There's a few that do this. Most of them were reading them as whole word units. So I said, well, let's do the reverse then. Let's look at the 74% that didn't pass the end of first grade outcomes, and let's look where they were at. Guess what we found? Most of them were here. They're actually, in the research when they looked, there wasn't a huge difference between if students were here and students were there. Now, what does that tell us in our schools? We have to provide blending instruction that's moving kids toward that unitization. That's what it's telling us. So we've got to do that. And when do we start blending instruction? In kindergarten, right? We're asking kids to blend CVC words in kindergarten. So in our instruction, we have to have some form of unitization practice. Now, having said that, that does not mean that kids aren't doing this in their blending when they first start, right? That's it. That's part of that process that kids go through as they're learning to blend. But what it tells us is in our instruction, we've got to get the kids to that place that they're reading words as whole units. And it's very strong in the evidence that we need to do that practice. All right, so blending is going left to right. We all know what blending is. So the next piece that I want to talk about is on this slide. What I find that most teachers don't know about blending is that there's a progression of easier words to more difficult words to learn to blend. Many of our reading programs, scope and sequence, do not spend enough time at that earlier progression of blending. So this would be a common progression of blending strategy routines that we can teach students. Continuous blending, meaning we're not stopping in between the sounds. So, mom, mom, right? That's continuous blending, that we're holding the sounds, not stopping between. It might be the word cat, cat, cat. That we're blending those sounds together. That's continuous blending. Then, and I'll come back to A through D. Number 2 is sound by sound blending, which I'll show you in a little bit. But basically, what that's modeling for students, what we do as good readers, we start at the beginning of the word and we look at each sound all the way through to the end of the word. So the sound by sound blending is modeling that for students, where we're just going to give them a sound by sound. The other thing that sound by sound blending does is starts teaching students to do units. Because if I'm building the word cat and we write the C and they say k, then we write the A and they say ah, then we go back and we blend those two sounds together and say ca. That's a unit, right? So we're starting to practice them doing some unitization practice. And then the last one is the spelling focus multisyllabic. A good reader looks at the beginning of the word and looks all the way through for those known sound spellings or word parts. So those affixes, those long vowel spellings, those digraphs, you're going through and looking for those. So it's the least amount of scaffolding kind of blending that we can do with our students. This is where we start losing kids in kindergarten, though. We do continuous blending. The easiest words for students to learn to blend are when all of the sounds are continuous. And that means they can hold each of those sounds. How many of your students try and blend the word cat and they go k, at, right? They haven't developed that phonological processing yet, and without holding that sound at the beginning, they never learn how to blend because they are never successful with blending. So if we have students that are doing that, we sometimes can go back and only present to them all continuous sounds within a word so that they're holding each of those sounds while we're going back up to recommendation 2 and building their phonological awareness processing as well, right? So it's going to be that combination of the two. After students can be successful there, then the next level of difficulty is the stop sound at the end of the word. Between B and C is a Grand Canyon for some kids. So that stop sound at the beginning of the word. Cat, bat, tap. How many of your programs, the very first story they have students read is something like tap, 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 right? Now, we've already skipped the first two, and we're already at tap, tap, tap when it's the very first story that's in there, and we start losing kids right then in our schools. And what we know is we can easily go back and fix that if we're aware of doing those check for understanding and we're monitoring that kids are mastering reading at those levels. And if they're not, we need to differentiate their instruction and provide intensified practice with all continuous sounds before they're going to be, if they can't read mom and man and fun, you know, with all continuous sounds, if they can't read those words, I will tell you right now, they're not going to read tap, tap, tap. Or the cat sat on the mat, you know, that has them all mixed up in there. And unfortunately, our programs don't allow for that practice. So it's something that we just need to make sure we're checking with our kids. And then it goes stop sound in the middle of the word. What we typically find students that can master blending with stop sounds at the beginning of the word don't really have trouble with the stop sound in the middle. It's not as much of an issue. So let's look at some blending. So here's an example then of continuous blending, and it shows you each of those different areas. So if you look at man, those are all continuous sounds, right? We can hold all of those sounds without distorting them. Sat, stop sound at the end. Cat, stop sound at the beginning and the end. Stop, if you notice we have all the stop sounds that you have to say quick, those quick sounds, we have them all bolded in this. So that when we're teaching students to blend, we're asking them not to stop between the sounds, and each time I point underneath, they're going to be saying that sound for as long as I'm pointing underneath. That's continuous blending. And then we come back, they're going to read it the fast way. So it would be blend. Man. Word, man. Blend. Sat. Word, sat. And so we're starting where we're having them do sound by sound by sound recoding, right? But this is beginning of kindergarten. By the time we get to middle of kindergarten, in the last half of kindergarten, we have to move them beyond that. And the only way we can move them beyond that is when we get the kids where they can read words like this, where that stop sound's at the beginning or in the middle. If we haven't got them there, no point in trying to move them to a higher level of blending practice. They're not going to be successful at doing it. So one of the things that we work on with kindergarten in particular is we do individual cards and individual practice. When we're looking at intensifying on that immediately by January or February of kindergarten, those students that are still not blending consonant, vowel, consonant words, we have them go back and do it intense practice with all continuous sounds in the word. And so we put together cards, and all of these are all continuous sounds, you know, and you can work with students in a small group until they can master that. So the next slide that's on the presentation too is just an explanation of how those cards are used. So you can get an idea from that. All right, sound by sound blending that I want to show you, and this is an instructional routine that we used in the one project that we did. I'm just going to show you sound by sound really quickly as a model so you can see what it looks like. And remember, this is after students have mastered blending with all continuous sounds and not stopping in between the sounds. Now we want to scaffold for them that they start at the beginning of the word and we work all the way through. This is also where we're really starting with that unitization that we know is so important for students. So you guys are my students. Sound, sound, blend. Sound, blend. Word. So you get the idea, right? Is that you're going sound by sound, and each time we add a new sound, then we ask you to read it as a unit. And that's, again, we start that about halfway to 2/3 of the way through kindergarten. Because that's, if we've mastered and we've caught those kids that we need to go back to all those continuous sounds, we can move students to that level.
And I think what you're all saying, and is really a part of the practice guide that I've mentioned several times too, is the integration of this. So while it might be that sounds is what needs to be mastered by the end of kindergarten, we're trying to get readers who can read text and understand text, right? That's our ultimate goal. And the only reason we teach sounds is so you can read words better. And the only reason we read words in isolation is so that you can read text better. And so we don't want to be in a situation where we're not integrating these and kids think sounds is like a separate content area and words are a separate content area. All of these things are only for, and we want the kids to understand this too, for us to read text better at their level, of course. But to teach sounds and not show them what those sounds are for, or to teach words and not show them what those words are for, starts to not be integrated.
So I do want you to really think about these blending activities and that progression, and where we truly do start losing kids that become special ed identified later when we know what we could have done in kindergarten that would have kept them from doing that. So I really want you to continue those conversations as well. So I'm going to quickly go through these other pieces of the action. Not that they're not important on there too, but I think the blending is one that we haven't had some of those strong enough conversations about. So I usually try and spend a little bit more time with that one. So this next one is instruct students in common sound spelling patterns. So that's very much related in that recommendation 2 as well, where we're relating that phonemic awareness, that phonological awareness to print. Well, it's also important in recommendation 3 as we're teaching students to blend. You know, that we're making sure we have a scope and sequence, that we're teaching students all of these different sound spellings. Okay? And so sound spelling cards is another part of that as well. You know, that we're going to systematically teach each of the students to do that. So the next one is teach students to recognize common word parts. I get super excited about this. This should start the beginning of 1st grade. Now, one of the really cool things, if we look at the group that White and group did, 20 prefixes account for 97% of the prefix words that appear in printed school English. Now, what does that tell us about those 20 prefixes? They need to have mastered those. And in 2 ways that we looked at it, we're talking about the decoding right now, but going back, I think Jeannie's word that she talks about integration of skills. Not only that they can recognize them in words in order to decode a word, but they can recognize the meaning of the word. Because the prefix or the suffix is going to change the meaning of that root word. So in schools that we provide technical assistance in and that we work in, we have them teach, starting in first grade, the prefix to recognize it as well as the meaning of it. And we do this, and these are the 20. So you have the list of 20 in your book. Same thing with suffixes. Somebody, question? Oh, okay. In the slides, you have it in the slides. I do think it's in the practice guide too. I think these lists are in the practice guide. I could be wrong. I have to remember and go back. It's been a while since we put that one together. Same thing though with the suffix. So you have a list of the 20 of the suffix in there. Give you an idea. Same thing that we do with our sound spelling cards, that we teach the students to recognize the affix, and we teach them the meaning of it. And again, starting in first grade. And we have the lists we do in first grade, the lists we add in second, what we add in third. Can you imagine? I could show you all these, and you guys wouldn't be able to come up with a really fast, student-friendly definition, right? But what you do is you start teaching your students by having these ready to go at the beginning, and I know what ones I'm going to teach at first grade, and we come up with the student-friendly definitions for that so that all students are learning that. So this one is miss, and it means wrong or badly. What's the prefix? Miss. What is the meaning? Now every time they see miss at the front of the word, what are they going to know? Yeah, it's wrong or badly to whatever that root word is. Students pick up on this so incredibly fast with a really short time, and then they recognize miss in a multisyllabic word as well as the vocabulary meaning. So we're helping them with that vocabulary, that word learning strategies instruction as well. So you've got your list of words for both of those. So obviously then that leads to manipulating word parts. So if you've taught those different prefixes and suffixes and what the meaning is, you can do some manipulation, some word building at the multisyllabic level as well. And then also they're going to have that more of that meaning. On the next part here is you give them text and have them circle and identify those different parts in text. So then they're looking at more connected text and being able to identify those. I strongly encourage you to do the meaning as well, even though that's not part of this recommendation. It certainly is important when we get to that vocabulary and comprehension as well. And then if we look at this one, have students read decodable words in isolation and in text. So that important part of that last and in text. So we can give them practice of those words at the word level, and then we want to make sure that they immediately have practice within the text level. One of the greatest moments of my teaching was I was in Laramie, Wyoming, so not that far from you guys, right? Yeah, not very far. I was in Laramie, Wyoming, and they said, Carol, we've got this first grade group. They're really struggling. It was November of first grade, and they were in need of Tier 2 instruction. Would you do a model lesson? So just like we've talked about, I did some of the isolation skills. We did the phonemic awareness. We did a sound spelling card. We did sounds practice. We did blending practice. We did words in isolation. Then we immediately got into connected text where they were applying the skills. There was a little boy in the group that had some really obvious autistic characteristics, but he was going right along with all the skill practice. And we get to the connected text. We were giving him the think time, that he could process each of those words. Then we got to the rereading fluency time. He started pounding his hands on the table. And I was like, oh dear, I'm losing it. And there were all kinds of adults in the classroom watching the lessons, and he started pounding his hands on the table, and he jumped up in the air, and he threw his hands in the air, and he said, this is the best day of my life. I can read. And it wasn't that there was magic powder dust in the lesson that day, and he obviously had some skills, right? But why was it so magical for him that day? he had the skills practice that were all integrated that led right up to that connected text reading, and then had the time that he was given the opportunity. It was the first time he actually heard himself as a reader. So again, going back to that integrated practice, getting to that connected text, as well as that time to process and be able to respond and think, okay? All right, next one, teach regular and irregular high-frequency words. So those irregular words that students just have to memorize, that they can't use their decoding skills for, are going to be an important part of the instruction as well. Here's and this is in the practice guide, this example activity is in the practice guide. So a star words activity, so you guys can go back and reference that as far as having students practice at the word level. And then introduce non-decodable words that are essential to the meaning. That's another one of the action steps. So if you look at these examples, dinosaur, villain, pigeon, Tyrannosaurus rex, those aren't words that are going to come up a lot, but they're going to be really important to whatever story they're going to read if those words are in that story, right? So we do need to make sure that we introduce those. It doesn't say we're teaching them to mastery, because they're not going to come in a lot. But before they read the connected text, what we know is there's some of those words that we have to familiarize our students with. All right, so before we take a break for the afternoon, I want everybody to pull out their note section. Go back and review those things that we've talked about in recommendation 3, how do they compare to what you're doing? Which we already started some discussions with that. So how does that compare to what you're doing? What are 2 or 3 of those actionable things that you can take back into your district or schools? All right, take a few minutes to do that. Hopefully that recommendation got you really thinking and talking about a lot of different things. Any questions that anybody wanted to bring up before the break? Anything? It definitely is the one area, I have to say, that really gets people thinking. I did hear some people talk about how do we do this professional development to teach teachers to understand this blending progression, and how do we do our delivery of the instruction with those discrete skills that's integrated into that connected text practice.